Europe in recent years, the rise of political and emotional nationalism from the grassroots level in everyday life to formal political institutions and parties, exploring the sort of triangulation between nationalism, identity, and cultural heritage at the local, national, and European levels. Our speakers will cite examples primarily from Northern Europe, the Netherlands, Iceland, and Scotland, but looking beyond as well. This is the first symposium in a 5-seminar series hosted by the Institute of International Affairs and the EU Info Center. The next one will focus on human rights in EU foreign policy and on the state of human rights in the EU following the financial crisis. It's going to take place here in 1 week's time, next Monday, from 12 to 1:30. The speakers will be Kinga Gönc, the former Foreign Minister of Hungary and member of European Parliament, and Pauline Torhold, specialist of the European External Action Service. Our opening speaker today is Herman Rudeberg, a European ethnologist and a cultural historian. Herman Rudeberg is a research fellow at the Mertens Institute in Amsterdam and also holds the endowed chair in the historical anthropology of Europe at the Free University of Amsterdam. Professor Rudeberg is a former head of the Department of Dutch Ethnology at the Mertens and currently leads the Institute's research group on Dutchness, the Dutchness of the Dutch, a project now in its early stages and with comparative ambitions at the European level. Starting with a recent case from the Netherlands, his talk today will explore the recent rediscovery of the national throughout Europe, or the resurgence of national sentiment. Nationalizing Europe? Question mark. The floor is yours.
Well, first, I want to thank the organizers and Waldemar and Don Gunnar especially for having me here at such short notice. I was asked a couple of weeks ago to come here, and somehow I managed to sit down and write my lecture for today. So I'm quite happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to our discussions and hopefully also to our cooperation with both the ethnologists and the historians here at the university. Let me start with a memorable event. At the end of 2012, on the 5th of December, a weird old man made his entry into UNESCO offices in Paris. Wearing a white beard glued to his chin, he was dressed in a long red cloak. He also wore a red bishop's mitre and held a long golden staff in his right hand. I did not witness the scene myself, I only heard the story, but I'm pretty sure that the man must have looked like this. And now yes, that's the one. And that's not exactly the most ordinary figure to visit the offices of UNESCO. Those of you knowing about Dutch folkways will have recognized St. Nicholas, well known to my compatriots, and of course to myself, as the nation's greatest children's friend, His feast is always celebrated on St. Nicholas Eve, the 5th of December, and for the little kids on the morning after. Having made his joyous entry into the Netherlands a few weeks earlier, on his name day he showers every Dutch family with larger or smaller gifts. It's an old tradition going back at least the 16th century. In the 17th century, it was even portrayed by the famous painter Jan Steen. Where is... This is the Jan Steen painting. Boasting this venerable history and still very much alive today, the Feast of St. Nicholas would be a perfect tradition to be inscribed in UNESCO's representative list of the world's intangible cultural heritage, This is exactly why the saint, heading a delegation of Dutch civil servants, came to Paris in person. But whether his fees will be inscribed in the list remains to be seen. It is certainly revealing that he made his UNESCO entry alone. His servant Black Pete, to all probability 19th century edition, was rather deviously left home. As you may know, Black Pete, or Zwarte Piet as we call him, is painted black. Mostly performed by whites, young women included, wearing an afro wig and dressed in some fancy pages costume. Pete's face is always blackened, his lips reddened with lipstick, and his ears hung with shiny golden rings. He's also not the smartest guy around. So that is Black Pete for you. Of course, if the delegation in its eagerness to promote this intangible heritage believed it could fool UNESCO with just leaving Black Pete at home, it was clearly wrong. A month later, in January last year, Vrain Shepard, a professor of social history at the University of Jamaica and working for the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights as an independent expert, demanded an official explanation from the Dutch government. In her letter, she included a complaint lodged with the High Commissioner which drew attention to the racial profiling of Black Pete, a remnant, it was believed, of the Netherlands' age-long involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. As was to be expected, mention was also made of the Dutch ambition to have the feast of St. Nicholas recognized as World Intangible Heritage. I will spare you the details, but last October things went definitely wrong. Hearing about the letter, Dutch newspapers assumed that the United Nations were out to abolish St. Nicholas. And that was certainly Professor Shepard's personal opinion. As she confessed on Dutch television, the whole feast was a throwback to slavery. Hearing her, the country rose up in arms. On Facebook, more than 2 million Dutch supported a spontaneous petition that Black Pete should stay, their comments often couching the most bilious hate speak. Who were the United Nations to take Black Pete away from us, to even suggest that the Dutch were just a bunch of racists? Events definitely hit a nerve and emotions were rife. It is certainly tempting to laugh the whole thing off, to see it more merely as another, though rather spectacular proof of this parochialism, a curious failing among the country's white majority to realize that blacks might take offense, especially the large groups of well-integrated Afro-Surinamese inhabitants. But it is obviously not just a Dutch issue. There's a much broader European dimension to the events. Europe's economic and political integration have advanced substantially since 1945. Recent years have also revealed a growing unease, indeed a fear, about weakening national cultural identities. Such feelings clearly manifested themselves after 2003, the year in which UNESCO actually launched its Convention on the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage. Though the Convention eulogizes the safeguarding of indigenous tradition and practices as enhancing cultural diversity and mutual tolerance, in its actual implementation in Europe, it was confronted, and still is confronted, with an unanticipated resurgence of national sentiment that may substantially thwart its lofty intentions. In particular, over the last 10 years, political ideas of peace, liberty, equality, solidarity, and cosmopolitanism have been opposed by less peaceful calls for closure, hierarchy, and limits to tolerance. Indeed, as we just saw with Black Pete, the Convention's present implementation in Europe, confronted with this rising sentiment, may not so much arrest as advance such calls for closure. To put it differently, what we may seem to witness now is a coalition of UNESCO's high-minded Enlightenment ideas, that the politics Claude Lévi-Strauss was a long-term consultant to UNESCO, with new manifestations of national sentiment, not only in the Netherlands, but throughout Europe. If my fellow countrymen now cherish their Dutchness, what they like to perceive and live as typically Dutch, the English cherish the Englishness, mixed like the Dutch sentiment with a solid dose of post-colonial melancholia, to quote Paul Gilroy. And similarly, the Danes enjoy their Danishness or Danskheid, the Germans, certainly after they won the Football World Championship in 2006, their Germanness, and the Icelanders, I presume, their Icelandicness. But here, of course, you are the experts. 3 years ago, the German ethnologist Irene Götz described all these new developments as a rediscovery of the national. And I believe this is a very helpful concept, allowing us to adopt an international perspective to compare the developments in Western Europe with those in Eastern and Southern Europe, and so forth. But as I will argue, it may also emphasize this one dimension, only describing the rediscovering, the discourses involved, and neglecting these discourses' rhetorical dimensions, their capacity to successfully appeal to the citizens' emotions and senses. To quote anthropologist Birgit Meyer, essential to studying cultural heritage is to include these aesthetics of persuasion. But let us first look at Irene Götz and her work. How did Götz define her rediscovery of the national? As you observed, while many studies have addressed the new forms of nationalism emerging after 1989 in Eastern Europe, far less attention has been paid to similar forms of nationalism emerging in the Western countries of Europe. In her own writings, Götz prefers the open notion of the national instead of the more reifying notions of nationalism and national identity, which do not really allow for the plurality of forms, semantics, and contexts involved. To provide you with a simple definition, I believe you may best construe her concept of the rediscovery of the national as the new naming, promoting, commercializing, and mediatizing of what is felt and lived as typically Dutch, Danish, English, German, Icelandic, etc. To put it more concretely, though since the 1970s, Western European states certainly like to style themselves as post-national, as having for good discarded such notions as Boden or soil, over the last 10 to 15 years, they all witnessed a harking back to the national in new and often strongly commercialized and mediatized forms. Increasingly, television and radio programs, international sports events, industrial, commercial, and financial companies, but also museums or the worlds of design, fashion, film, literature, music, and architecture, started appealing to what I would like to describe as the emotions always lying dormant in the inhabitants' mostly implicit feelings of nationness. Such appealing may be playful and informal, but they may also have the more serious exclusionary dimensions, leaving little space for UNESCO's ideals of cultural diversity and mutual understanding, certainly when politics is involved as well. Let me give you a few examples, all taken from the Netherlands over the last decade. Among its most popular television programs are, for instance, a quiz starring the celebrities being tested on what they know of their country, Ik hou van Holland, and scoring even higher in the ratings, a dating program helping young Dutch farmers to a wife, Boeren zoekt vrouw. Similarly, Dutch pop artists sold millions of records singing the sentimental praises of their fatherland, Nederland o Nederland, we houden van Oranje, Nederland mijn vaderland. Dutch cinema followed suit, producing nostalgic movies situated in the Dutch past, while Dutch novelists rediscovered historical novel, also located in the national past. In the same years, for whatever reason, the big department stores started selling household objects displaying Holland symbols, tulips, windmills, wooden shoes, and Delftware. Thus, fashion designers, among them Victor and Rolf, though already working in Paris, sought inspiration in Dutch wooden shoes and folkloric dress. Architects started their own neo-traditionalism, even revamping the wooden houses north of Amsterdam. And finally, the already older Oranje madness manifesting itself at the international sports events, football and skating events in particular, rose to new heights, often dressing whole streets in orange. I brought some examples. So this is a kind of overview of Dutchness. and this is a large bank promoting the Orange Madness, Dutchness. Oranje zijn we allemaal, we are all orange. And this Unox, that is, well, they sell sausages. So they also adopted this orange image. This is about skating again. This is Delftware, also quite surprisingly quite popular again with many parts of the population. It comes of course from the 17th century. And here's also just one of these big department stores also having all these Delftware blue and white teacups, coffee cups, etc. I don't believe that your coffee or tea still tastes the same. Certainly it tastes somewhat worse than before, but it's quite popular now with many parts of the population. And that all happened over the last 10 years. Of course, then part of all the Oranje Madness, which I showed already to you, are the patriotic songs of the pop artists. And I'm afraid you will hear them again, though probably not for long, in Brazil in June. Now, if these commercializing and mediatizing practices may still be classified among more playful forms of the new Dutchness, other practices come under its openly political and exclusionary forms. In 2006, the Dutch government, fearing a disintegration of the Dutch nation, having seen to political murders, decided to again promote the nation's folk traditions. And indeed, the almost discarded notion of volkscultuur was all of a sudden again discussed, quite seriously discussed in this parliament, a sure sign that post-national times, if they ever existed, were over in the Netherlands. What emerged was what the Dutch anthropologist Peter Geschieren described as a culturalization of citizenship, a new importance attached to culture and morality in shaping citizenship and integration policy. Within the political arena, cultural diversity was now construed as an unwelcome and problematic ideal, a threat to the nation's social cohesion. Hence the interest of the Dutch cabinet and parliament in forcing immigrants to take naturalization exams. They should acquire a basic knowledge of their national language and national culture, all summarized in official national handbooks and national canons, while school books were rewritten in a similar vein. Typically, these texts also promote emancipatory attitudes to women and gays, actually a legacy of the progressive 1970s, but presently at both ends of the political spectrum, celebrated as typically Dutch, and of course in other countries as typically German, Danish, and suppose also typically Icelandic. These are national virtues to be proud of, part of Europe's great Judeo-Christian heritage, though scholars writing on the intriguing phenomenon of homo-nationalism did not miss the exclusionary implications. To conclude my short talk here, let me briefly mention two central issues, one a comparative, the other a more theoretical issue, which we are now exploring in Amsterdam, and which we hope to explore more thoroughly in a European context with a group of Danish, German, and especially Icelandic colleagues, among them Professors Hafstein, Halfdanarson, and Rastvik. As you noticed, I have told you more about what is presently going on in my own country than in Europe as a whole. What we urgently need is a European project in which we may compare the developments in Western European countries with those in Eastern and Southern European countries, because what is happening in these various countries may be quite different. For example, like the Netherlands knows its Dutchness and Iceland its Icelandicness, so Spain knows its Hispanidad, this was already promoted by General Franco, and Italy its Italianità. But how powerful are these certain constructions? Perhaps we should look at some general national factors. Like the Western countries, Spain and Italy have seen the influx of large groups of immigrants, but they are still confronted with separative movements in the regions, especially Spain facing both the Basque Country and Catalonia. So what does that mean for Hispanidad? And is there also something like Catalanidad? In contrast, Eastern European countries have not been confronted with large groups of immigrants, nor do they witness presently any separatism. For them, the internal threatening other may be primarily the Roma, the large Gypsy population in their own countries. It is they who are not typically Polish, Hungarian, Romanian, and so on. So comparing how these various possibly determinant factors may make a difference will make a very interesting European project. The second issue I'd like to briefly mention refers to René Gutz's concept of the rediscovery of the national. This concept may be too simple, too one-dimensional, I believe. Rediscovery suggests that something got lost, but now has been found again, apparently unchanged. But can we really say that the national was lost and found, and that it also remained intact? Is much of this rediscovery also construction or invention? And if you would allow for elements of construction or invention, what would this exactly mean? It's certainly possible to study all the various constructions of the national, focusing on the politicians and the policy measures, or on all the commercializing and mediatizing involved. But I believe it's really important to go beyond such constructivist analysis and ask ourselves how such constructions actually work. How exactly do they resonate, and what do they resonate with? Obviously, none of the recent constructions of the national would have worked if they couldn't have tapped into more tacit or implicit national feelings, into what has been described as a country's battle, visceral, or everyday nationalism, its inhabitants' almost natural feelings of nationness. The English social psychologist Michael Birek, who coined the notion of banal nationalism, provided a very helpful example when he pointed to the American flag hanging from every government building without any American citizen, or hardly any American citizen, noticing anymore. Banal or visceral nationalism is about everyday practices somehow, but mostly implicitly, reminding citizens of the nation, of their place in it, and of its place in the world, as the English sociologist Richard Jenkins put it. Perhaps nationness would be the most convenient concept here. Now where everyday life we somehow trace the nation, piece it almost unthinkingly together. In sum, and here I would like to finish, it will be important to look carefully at the agency involved, not merely at all the constructions of the national, but also at the resonating, the emotional, sensory, and even corporeal hold on citizens, what Birgit Meyer had in mind as she coined the concept of the aesthetics of persuasion. And we should look at the citizens themselves, at the everyday practices of nationness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Herman. And we will have time for one or two quick questions after each speaker, and then we'll have time for general discussion at the end. So if there are any questions in the room for Professor Rudeberg, welcome to raise them now. I will start actually with mine, because I'm very interested in especially what you end with, this question of how the national resonates in the everyday, and the concept of visceral or emotional nationalism that you raise. So if I may ask, how do you see that as different from political nationalism, and how does one actually go about studying emotional everyday nationalism?
Well, it's I had been discussions before, of course, on especially this kind of implicit social knowledge. So this is a well-known concept in the social sciences, and it's a feeling that over the last decades, social scientists, also historians, have been looking primarily at the construction of national identity, of nationalism, so a kind of linguistic approach, just looking at actually the precise historical origins and developments of all these nationalisms, and getting away, of course, from these old notions that that in some ways national identity would refer to, let's say, the core of the nation, these old essentialist notions. So this constructivism has been very important for studying national identity, and movements like nationalism. But then you can ask a question, if we know these are constructions, then how do we explain that these constructions still have this emotional hold on so many citizens? What is going on here? So it means that you start looking at the rhetorics involved, and that may mean, for example, that you take this pop music and you go to all these manifestations where these pop songs, whether the Dutch football team is playing, or whether there are other manifestations where these pop songs are being sung by really thousands of men and women in the arenas. And so there's a kind of emotional and also sensory, corporeal identification going on exactly at this kind of events. So you can go to these events for studying this. But it is also about, let's say, our everyday lives. So one of my students, he'll defend his dissertation next Friday, and he studied the presence of kind of slavery consciousness among the Afro-Surinamese population of the Netherlands. So there is this discourse on Dutch slavery that has been studied by many historians, many sociologists. But then what about the Surinamese population itself? How do they feel, how do they experience this discourse in their everyday lives? And it turns out that there are many relations between this discourse and how they actually go about their business. So they have their own Surinamese music, they have their Winti religion, and this is all mixed now with this discourse. And it is also quite an emotional and also a sensory identification with this discourse of slavery, the efforts of their leaders to get the history of slavery accepted in the Dutch historical canon, etc. But it also is very much part of their everyday lives. They have to take a stance if they do not want this or not, what they think about this emancipation, etc. And my student really made a very interesting ethnography of these feelings and emotions. So my answer would be, how do you study all this? Sorry for my long answer. Is that you just go into the population, or you just go into these groups and you do this ethnography, and that is really what has been missing too much so far in all these national identity studies. Sorry for my long answer.
Well, that's perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you for
An inspiring lecture with a broad overview of the rediscovery of the national, with these wonderful Dutch examples of St. Nicholas and Black Pete and the UN Human Rights High Commissioner's beef with Father Christmas, and for this call to new research and new avenues in research on the national. So thank you. Our second speaker today is Guðmundur Hálfdanarson. Guðmundur Hálfdanarson is a professor of history at the University of Iceland, where he holds the Jón Sigurðsson Chair. He specializes in cultural and political history, and his research deals in particular with various aspects of the history and theory of nationalism. In his talk today, Guðmundur will speculate whether the Icelandic opposition to Iceland's participation in European integration is a part of a larger populist anti-EU current, also manifest in the Front National in France and the UKIP in Britain, or whether it is instead rather an isolated and homegrown phenomenon. Guðmundur, the floor is yours.
And I thank you for the invitation to the Alþjóðamálastofnunar and the European Information Agency. One of the most striking political factors in Europe in recent months has been the rather rapid rise of populist parties. And there are parties that can be and have been called populist in more or less all European countries. And in all European countries they seem to be gaining ground. From Fremskrittspartiet in Norway, which is now in government, and really the only such party as I know of that has come so far, but we have similar parties in other Nordic countries like Sverigedemokraterna and Dansk Folkeparti, and in Finland, originally two Finns, but I'm not going to try to pronounce the name. No, I'm not going to try. UKIP in Britain, Vlaams Belang in Belgium, Partij voor de Vrijheid in the Netherlands, Front National in France, and so on and so forth. You can continue to go down the list. And you could also argue that the Tea Party movement in the United States is a certain expression of similar emotions in the United States, although that is in a totally different kind of political context. And it's the party, and the reason why people are talking so much about the party at the moment is the kind of coming European election on the 22nd of May, where these parties are predicted to do very well, ranging in prediction from 16-20% to 25% of the popular vote. And they will even get more representation probably in these elections than anywhere else, because they have had a rather difficult time to come through in elections where there is a winner-take-all system, like in England or France, where they, even if they have in recent years polled quite well, they've not been able to get any or very few representatives. But in European elections, there is a proportional representation, which means that they will get a number of representatives in the European Parliament. And also because the fact is that the people most interested in the elections to the European Parliament are the people that want to get rid of the European Union. So they do actually take part in these elections, which means that they come to the polls in greater numbers than the people that really support the process. Well, this is a very eclectic movement, and it's very difficult to generalize about it because the parties are different in different countries. And this is one of the characteristics of nationalism and national emotion, because they all kind of culture or nurture what makes us seem to be different. So in a sense, they become different even if they follow very similar patterns. So nationalism is a kind of general universal ideology in a sense. At the same time, it's very particular in its place because it nurtures the things that sets us apart rather than unite us. They are rooted in, these parties I've been discussing most of them are rooted in the kind of right-wing organic nationalism of the past in France, in Boulanger and Action Française in the early 20th century, which was a kind of right-wing nationalism, often related to the church, supporting hierarchy and anti-Semitism. They all emphasize the call to the people, and that's what makes them populist. And these people are mythical, imagined and idealized, and we saw one version of that kind of idealization of the Dutch before. They often have a charismatic leader, and they are anti-elitist, and they are xenophobic. And this kind of analysis of these parties I take from Dominique Reynaud's recent book, Le Nouveau Populisme, which kind of gives you the kind of broad outline of these parties. And they are what kind of unifies them and makes it possible to us to generalize in a sense that they kind of, all of them tend to focus on 4 different points. First of all, it's immigration. And immigration is one of the kind of unifying theme in more or less all of these parties. They all have rather negative position, take a negative position to increase immigration into Europe, especially immigration coming from outside of Europe. They are all rather skeptical towards European integration, although their attitudes towards the European Union varies. Some, like UKIP, fight for Britain's kind of Britain going out of the European Union, but many others accept their country's position in the European Union, but want to scale down the Union and change it radically. They're all, in a sense, a reaction to globalization, and immigration is, of course, part of that kind of process. And they have also gained ground in recent years because of the financial crisis, and you can see that in different ways in the European countries, where the Germans are against the financial crisis because they feel they are paying for the Greek kind of squandering their own money, while the Greeks find the Germans overbearing because the European Union forces them to make all kinds of sacrifices which they're not willing to make, especially because they blame the crisis on the elites and not their own behavior. René kind of coined the term populisme patrimonial to describe a new type of populism in the recent years. And because, as I said before, these parties are rooted in the kind of right-wing spectrum of the political spectrum. But that is not really the case now. They've been moving away, for example, from explicit and virulent racism towards different ways of expressing themselves. So it's very often very difficult to place them on the kind of right to left scale. And Renier says, and he defines this as a conservative and very defense of material patrimony, that is of a certain standard of living, and of immaterial patrimony, that is a certain lifestyle. So it's a combination of both trying to defend a standard of living which people feel that is threatened very often by immigration, and increasing pressure on welfare systems, for example, in the Nordic countries. And then there is also the kind of challenge to what people feel are their lifestyles, their national or traditional lifestyles, very often coming from Muslim immigrants, that they feel are threatening ways in which they need to defend. And Renier talks about the 4 great upheavals of recent years, and I mentioned most of them before, Europe, globalization, and immigration, but he also lays heavy emphasis on what he calls the aging population, or the graying of Europe, which is a kind of underlying problem that is not very much discussed. And immigration is, in a certain sense, reaction to that fact that Europe is, the kind of demographic structure of Europe is changing. And immigration is a kind of relief to that fact where we are. I don't remember, he gave a year when the Germans would go extinct if they would only have the kind of natural growth. I think it's late 21st century. Immigration fills into these gaps. So there is this kind of development from overt racism to anti-multiculturalism and Islamophobia, which is the kind of connecting themes in these parties. And what is interesting in this development is that the parties are very strong in the Nordic liberal north, which is very prosperous, and even in countries where the financial crisis hit not very hard, like in the Nordic countries in general, these parties are gaining very much ground. In the Nordic populist parties, they, for example, support very strongly the welfare system, while in the Netherlands they pit what is called the Dutch liberalism against Islam and the threat to the kind of liberal ways of life, individual liberties and equal opportunities for the sexes, and they portray Islam as a threat to these things. I just took a few examples for some of these parties just to give us a small picture of how the different parties talk about the different issues. Immigration, as I said, is very heavily represented in all of these agendas. You can get it for everywhere. And there is this kind of strong emphasis in the kind of immigration discourses on integration. Immigration is fine as long as the people that move into the countries integrate totally into the culture where they come to, take up the traditions and the languages and cultural memories of the adopted country. And as long as that is the case in most of these kind of platforms, immigration is seen as positive, at the same time as all of them, or more or less all of them, emphasize the need to limit immigration, especially immigration coming from abroad, and some of them are very explicit on their belief that people coming or people Muslims can really not be integrated. That there is something in their ways of thinking that makes it impossible for them to become the real Dutch or real Danes. European Union is also, as I say, one of these issues that is in all of these platforms. Naturally, the European Union is in most European political platforms, because European Union is a very prevalent and dominating political fact in political life in Europe. And again, I quote him here, where he says that No to Europe combines xenophobia, a strong hostility to Islam, the denunciation of bureaucracy and the Brussels bureaucracy, and reject of the dominating parties. So these are the kind of issues that lay under much of the populist reaction to the European Union. And I'm not going to read these quotes. Some of them are in languages that are probably not very familiar to you. But others are quite understandable. And as I said before, most of these parties talk about the European Union, want to scale it down, but only some of them really call for the withdrawal from the European Union of their states. And UKIP is one of these parties, and UKIP is really, their main focus is the European Union and Britain's withdrawal from it. For them, immigration is more a secondary issue, although it comes always through. And the third issue that is very prevalent in all of these platforms is the emphasis on what is called national culture, and that is something that was talked about before. And there is this kind of heavy emphasis on the characteristics which the leaders of these parties see as the dominating and the most important characteristics of their particular nations and see their nations as unique examples of culture which has to be protected in the world that is changing. Okay, what about Iceland? What makes Iceland a little bit peculiar in this respect is the fact that immigration has not been a political issue in Icelandic politics. And immigration is really the motivating issue for most of the populist parties. Whatever they say, it is the kind of fear of immigration and all the challenges that immigration brings with it, which is the kind of motivating forces for most of these parties, and has always been. In Iceland, I know only of one attempt to make immigration a major political issue in Icelandic politics, and that was the Liberal Party, or the Frjálslynda in the elections in 2007, and even in that election, it was a kind of half-hearted attempt that not all of the people supporting the party were really in favor of, and so you can say that even if some of the same bells were sounded in the lead up to the election, and I have here advertisement from the party from I think 1st of April, if I remember correctly, of 2007, right before the elections, where they emphasized the importance of scaling down immigration into Iceland, which had been increasing very much at the height of the economic boom of 2006-2007. So there was this kind of reaction to that boom, and the reaction was that we needed to slow immigration down because otherwise we would end up in the same mess as the other countries around us. It seemed to, this kind of attempt seemed to give the party a little bit of boost in the early part of the lead up to the election, but in the end the party didn't gain that much by this attempt, in part because it really didn't push the issue very hard when it came to the election. So that is really the only time I know of where immigration has been a kind of major issue, or where a party tried to play on the kind of fears for immigration in order to gain support. Immigration is mentioned in the recent elections, was mentioned in almost every political platform, and you can see slight differences in their emphasis. The parties to the center and right, the Independence Party and Progressive Party, by no means are negative towards immigration. They talk rather positively about it, but they emphasize the importance of integration and the kind of need for people that immigrate to Iceland to learn the language and to learn about the culture in order to be able to participate in society. But there is not a very strong emphasis on kind of acculturation or opposition to multiculturalism. It is more couched in the terms of you need these tools in order to be full citizens in Icelandic society. Parties on the left, they are more kind of positive towards multiculturalism and emphasize the immigrants' possibilities, opportunities to promote their culture in Iceland. One of the parties are fairly positive or very positive towards immigration, and Islamophobia does not appear in these platforms, although it is rampant in the blogosphere. I mean, you don't need to read many blogs to see that even if the parties are not promoting these ideas, there are a number of people who think in exactly the same way as the voters of the populist parties in Europe. There is a reason for this kind of lack of interest in immigration, the fact that non-European immigration in Iceland is very limited? I'm not so sure, because it is not really the immigrants who are the cause for these feelings. It's much more the perceptions of immigrants that is the cause. So there are countries that have a lower immigration rates than Iceland, that have where immigration plays a large role in the public discourses. So I don't think that is really the reason. I must admit, sometimes scholars have to admit, I have no idea why it's not an issue. I feared, I gave a lecture in 2007 when I went through campaign of President of the Liberal Party. And then I said, if something comes to this was in 2007, if something happens to the Icelandic economy, which it did in 2008, all these feelings will probably explode, but they did not. And I was fairly surprised that immigration didn't become more of an issue in society in 2009, 2010, with growing unemployment and growing competition in the labor market. It really did not. Well, what about Icelandic Euroscepticism? It's absolutely certain that Euroscepticism is very strong in Iceland. It's very widespread. And I just went to, just in order to understand what Euroscepticism, a kind of public Euroscepticism, what the kind of associations that promote Euroscepticism, what they emphasize in their opposition to the European Union. And this is just a list, a translation of the list that Heimsýn, the organization of Eurosceptics in Iceland, lists as their reasons why we should say no to the European Union. And what is clear from this list is that in some ways this is a kind of typical Euroscepticism on a European level. There is a heavy emphasis on loss of sovereignty. There is this kind of emphasis on the rather distant and opaque power in Brussels. And there is also, in the Icelandic discourse, is a very strong emphasis on loss of authority over the resources. That is a very strong argument against the European Union, the fishing quotas, agriculture, and so on and so forth. What is absent in this list in Heimsýn, and is not mentioned at all, is immigration. It is not mentioned as a problem. And you cannot really say that this list demonstrates a very strong opposition to globalization or rampant xenophobia. I mean, if you just go from the list, that is not the way, is not the reason that Heimsýn gives for their opinions. But what is unusual with Icelandic Euroscepticism is, first of all, that it's entirely mainstream. That the two parties which are now in government in Iceland both have declared openly and with no hesitation that they do not wish Iceland to become members of the European Union, and that these two parties are the kind of foundation of the Icelandic political system for the last 80 years. They have been in power more or less continuously, one or with two together or with other parties for most of the time that Iceland has been a democratic sovereign state. And they are absolutely and unequivocally about joining the European Union. And that is very, very unusual, because in Europe these mainstream parties are usually fairly pro-Europe. Another thing which I find has always baffled me, and I cannot understand either. Well, I think I can understand it, but it sounds rather inexplicable. And that is the fact that the same parties support the European Economic Area quite heartily, which is a kind of membership in the European Union where you get many of the things that are supposedly negative things that supposedly come with membership. That is supported wholeheartedly, which shows that what Heiðrún Bergmann, for example, has been demonstrating and emphasizing is that Iceland has the need of many of the things that the European Union gives countries, and mostly then access to markets, which is very important for Icelanders, and the European Economic Area as a way to get around that question. So you can ask yourself if sovereignty is really the issue here, or is it something else? I'm not going to go into it now, but in any details, but in a sense, what you can say is the root, my reading of this is that one of the roots for the Icelandic exceptionalism, these kind of particular ways of viewing Euroscepticism in Iceland, is the kind of, they are rooted in the foundational myths of the Icelandic Republic, which are based on a very strong sense that sovereignty is the real rockbed of Icelandic society. And this is the way in which you read history. you read the history of Iceland as a struggle for independence, for sovereignty, and the history is read in a sense as reflecting that kind of importance of sovereignty, and therefore politicians feel that this is, and not feel, but they believe this is a firm belief, and maybe they're right. I'm not saying that, but that sovereignty is really the kind of something that they need to defend. And therefore, questions of sovereignty have a very strong emotional appeal. And I totally agree with Herman that emotions are very often overlooked when you look at politics or ways people act in a rational manner. Rationality is very often conditioned by people's emotions. It's also, you could call it post-colonial mentality. We were discussing and debating on the weekend if Iceland would have been called a colony, but there is definitely a very strong post-colonial mentality in Iceland, the feeling that we have been colonized for a long time, and Icelanders do not want to get mingled with the colonial power in Europe again, and so that kind of emotion is very strong. And therefore sovereignty must not be surrendered. At the same time as the country is in desperate need for allies and markets, and therefore all of these institutions we join, usually, not always, NATO, EFTA, and EEA, it caused a huge debate. And the parties that have supported these entrance into these organizations very often have to hide why and try to read this and define these institutions into a kind of Icelandic institution. NATO became thus a defensive association for Iceland, and the NATO force in Iceland was an Icelandic defense force. And surprise, surprise, when NATO the United States didn't need it anymore, they went away. So, okay. As Icelanders, you know that Icelandic politics are in a flux at the moment, and there seems to be a new political landscape emerging. I'm a historian, so I'm not going to speculate about the future in this sense, but you can see that the kind of unqualified Euroscepticism seems to be moving to the kind of peripheries or the fringes, not to the kind of outside fringes, but at least there seems to be a growing middle, which is at least willing to contemplate if membership in the European Union is a good idea or not. And this is happening both to the left and the right. I don't know how it will change the center-right political scene, but I definitely think it will. I think, for example, that in the future the European Economic Area will be problematic. It is very difficult if you portray the European Union as the Soviet Union or the Third Reich re-established, to say that we should be in a very strong relationship with them. I mean, you cannot really have it both ways. I mean, if the European Union is the Soviet Union, then you kind of don't want to be too close to them. We do not deal with the devil. That's something that you cannot do. So as soon as the rhetoric becomes so hostile, it is very difficult not to take the next step. And I think, although as I say I'm a historian, I'm not going to predict. There seems to be a growing space in the politics form. Real right-wing populist party on the same level and with the same agendas as the European ones. There is strong popular Euroscepticism in Iceland, which a political party can nurture. And I'm absolutely sure that you all agree with me that Icelanders are not totally immune to xenophobia. So I think it would be possible to drum up these feelings that have been drummed up in our neighboring countries to a great effect. Now in all of the Scandinavian countries, these populist parties are strong forces, and they seem to be growing stronger. So I don't think there is any reason to believe that Iceland is in any different. And that was what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much, Benedict. I'm sure
there are questions in the room. We have time for 1 or 2 questions or comments.
Yes, hello, my name is... Hello, my name is Evrópusambandið. I'm a professor of politics at the University. Thank you very much for this overview. I agree with most of your analysis. As you said, I've just started in a new course project on populist communications. I'm a bit interested now. I'm been sort of engaged in comparing Iceland to the European populist parties, and I'm interested in your analysis where you find similarities but also dissimilarities in the Icelandic discourse. I would, however, want to challenge you perhaps on one thing. You point out that anti-immigration isn't very high on the agenda in Iceland. These parties here, or this rhetoric here, is not very festive with anti-immigrantism. But anti-immigrantism in Europe is mostly anti-Muslim. It's not really anti-other Europeans. And this is completely lacking in Iceland. And I would suspect that if we had similar levels of Muslim society in Iceland, you would see the same similarities. Also, with the Liberal Party leading up to the 2007 election, there was a Gallup poll coming out by end of October 2006, saying that the Liberal Party had completely collapsed down to 2%, 2.3% or something like that. Then the party enters into their anti-immigrant rhetoric, and by the end of the month they polled above 11%. And the threshold to Iceland's parliament is 5%, and they survived past that threshold in the coming election. And I would claim that was solely because of their anti-immigrant stance of the time. Also, I think one of the interesting aspects of Icelandic populism is the nationalistic rhetoric, the deep nationalistic rhetoric. And I wanted to hear perhaps a little bit more from you, as you of course are experts in that, because I suspect that's across the board. And this is perhaps why there hasn't been the same room for a specific party of that sort in Icelandic politics, because it's sort of incorporated by all of the mainstream parties. So if you could perhaps elaborate a bit on that. Okay.
Last point, I'm only going to say yes. Because it take too long. But we didn't have to rediscover it anyway. Our rediscovering the national. I mean, it was always there and openly so. Of course, I agree with Herman. It has always been there in all of the European countries, but in Iceland, it was very much overtly in the political discourses and this. So you didn't need to found a nationalistic party to be a nationalistic. All the parties were openly so in Iceland. And this is one of the things that is changing now. But I don't know where it will lead. The question if the kind of lack of Muslims in Iceland is one of the reasons why immigration has not been such an issue in Iceland politics. Of course, it may be one of the reasons, but I don't think you need Muslims to fear them. You often fear the unknown, and maybe if you have many Muslims, you would fear them less because you know them better. So I don't think it is really the only reason. As I said, I really don't know how to explain it, and I've been sure for a long time that it will appear, because, as you say, you could clearly see it in the polls that this had an effect on opinions in opinion polls, especially in late 2006. You could see the kind of support of the Liberal Party rise at the same time as they took this up. But as I said before, the party did not go hard on this agenda in the election. It was pushed aside. It was not really the main issue when it came to the election. So I've been criticized by the Liberals for saying these things, and I just want to emphasize that they are right. This is not an issue that became a major issue in the last days of the campaign. Although I also agree with you that the reason why they raised it is one of the reasons why they did not do that badly in the elections.
All right, thank you. In the interest of time, I think we should move on, although I know there are a few questions in the room already, and I have some as well. Especially I'm wondering about the space you speak of for right-wing populist parties to emerge and whether that's not already being filled. But our next speaker will thank Willem again for his talk. Our final speaker today is Alison Bales. Alison Bales is an adjunct professor at the University of Iceland, where she's focused on security studies, in particular in the North and the Arctic, and on problems of small states. A former British diplomat, Alison bought a part-time home on the Scottish borders recently, last year, and is just back from Scotland. And she's now working also with a Glasgow-based think tank called Scottish Global Forum to look at the international implications of potential Scottish independence. Her talk today will reflect on the independence movement in Scotland in a European perspective, and with a view to the referendum on Scottish independence 4 months from now. So, a place in the world for Scotland. Alison, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for letting me speak on this. It's exciting because it lies a bit outside my normal field. And so I'm a bit lacking in expertise as well as time to give you a full picture of the Scottish issue. I've decided to concentrate on themes that link up somehow with the two previous speakers and will often actually provide a contrast to the general picture that they drew. For more information on the Scottish issue, I believe that the Institute of International Affairs will be providing some more links and materials online and will indeed be holding further public events on this issue for those who are interested. I should start with at least a few facts. As you heard, Scotland will vote on 18 September this year on the question, should Scotland be an independent country? The background, well, we could go back to the Dark Ages when Kenneth MacAlpin created a single independent Scotland, or to 1603 when Scotland was joined with England under the same king, and 100 years later went through a formal union. For practical purposes, we only need to look back as far as the last elections to the Scottish Parliament, and that Parliament was created as one of the main steps in a process over the last 20 years of Scotland gaining greater autonomy from England, particularly in handling its internal affairs. That last election brought to power a strong Scottish nationalist party majority, with almost all the other seats being filled by Labour. So the two parties governing in London now, the Conservatives and Lib Dems, are hardly represented in Scotland. This nationalist government proposed a referendum, and London agreed to it. It's very important for the legitimacy of the process to understand that the date and the question have been fully agreed between the parliaments in London and Edinburgh. Who will vote? It's everybody who is registered to live in Scotland and pay local tax at the time. So it's not based on ethnicity. I will vote because I bought a house there, but an Icelandic student doing a 3-year degree in Edinburgh will also vote, as will, for instance, a Chinese student, which I think is quite interesting. What will happen? Well, there are two obvious outcomes, a yes vote to independence or a no vote. What's interesting to look at is that there may be a third alternative, because the Labour Party has already strongly hinted that if the Scots choose to stay in the union with England, they could be given a further step in autonomy as a kind of compensation or reward. And I think the political logic of doing that would be strong if the vote is close, so as to maintain a kind of positive mood between the parts of the United Kingdom. Will the vote be close? Well, at the moment, the latest polls in May are showing of people who have made up their minds, as many as 60% may vote against independence and 40 in favour. However, the figures have been different at different times. At 2 occasions, last September and April, they almost met. It was almost half and half. And in the end, everything will depend on those who are saying at the moment they don't know, which is about 15%. The best guess is that the vote will go against independence, but that it will indeed be very close. Now, the independence campaign in Scotland does not rest on 2 things that we've heard are now very typical of nationalist movements in the rest of Europe. It is not about ethnicity. It's not about anti-English feeling. The relationship between Scots and English, I think, fits what anthropologists call the relationship of teasing cousins. You can make jokes against each other, quite unpleasant ones sometimes, but you're part of the same family. There's great understanding and great acceptance. Many English find the Scots very charming. I can tell you it doesn't happen so often the other way. There is also no evidence of strong anti-immigrant feeling in Scotland, where many different populations have been well absorbed, so that you can see a Chinese or Indian person speaking with a strong Scottish accent. The places for racial violence in the UK are the Midlands and around London. If you get bad violence in Glasgow, it's more likely to be between Catholic and Protestant. And this leads to the next point, which is that Scottish nationalism is not separatist or particularist. It wants to separate from the UK but get closer to Europe. And in fact, the nationalists are using very much the fact that the English government has toyed with the idea of a referendum on getting out of the EU. So in Scotland, they will say, if you want to be conservative and prudent, if you want to stay in the EU, you have to vote for independence. That really brings out, I think, a big difference between the Scottish movement and others that we've been hearing about. Why are the Scots so keen to stay in the EU? Well, it's partly money speaking. They profit very, very well from the structural funds in particular, and they know, as Icelanders maybe don't always realise, that they do need the free trade, and they do need the EU to protect them in negotiations with China, or indeed in strategic crises like the one we have at the moment on Ukraine. At the same time, the Scottish relationship to Europe is very different at an emotional and cultural level from what we've heard about in Iceland. Scotland historically had to reach out over England to find allies on the continent, usually in France, to defend its identity and its separateness. So French soldiers were fighting the English on the Scottish border as recently as the 1560s, and they did support later attempts by the Stuarts to reassert an independent Scotland. Scots also have always been well respected abroad. They have a remarkable history of success, I'm afraid usually as mercenary soldiers or generals, but also as thinkers, as scientists and so on. And they have no reason to feel being in Europe will crush their identity. It's more, it will be a bigger scene on which we can play and be respected. So if it's not about that, there are at least 2 themes that I think join up with other European cases, at least cases where nationalists are trying to create new independent states. One is the very simple point about the wish for self-rule, self-determination, to make one's own decisions and one's own mistakes. And I think we can clearly see that there is a kind of aggregating process with devolution and autonomy. When you have some, you want more. And although many other things are different, I think it's interesting to compare Scotland with Faroes and Greenland and maybe even Åland in this Nordic region as cases of this kind of slippery slope towards more explicit demands for full independence. Economics is important. Now, the Scottish government calculate that if Scotland keeps control of North Sea gas and oil, and it can cut some areas of spending, in particular it proposes to cut defence spending almost in half, it will then have more money left over for social purposes and to make improvements in welfare. To continue, for instance, forever the present arrangement where there are no university fees. That makes a big difference from England. Another more polemical point that you do here is that Scotland would have survived better in the recent crash and recession if it had been able to make its own decisions rather than having to go along with a London government that was ideologically committed to severe economies. And I mention that point because I understand exactly the same argument has been made in Catalonia in its bid for independence, and it helps to explain how even populations who are quite rich and quite okay may say, well, relatively we would have done better if we had not had, in this case, the domination from London. Things that are more unusual and I think interesting in the Scottish case are first, Scotland votes to the left, as you have heard. I mean, there are hardly any Conservative voters left in Scotland, and that's no accident because there is a general Scottish attachment to egalitarianism, welfare, social justice, freedom of education, freedom of social movement, you know, all those kinds of ideas that I would call social rather than liberal ideas. It is a big argument made in the current campaign, why should Scotland be ruled by a government in London which it, in essence, didn't elect and which it actually rejects in political and ideological terms? The downside of this is that if Scotland did become independent, the Conservatives would probably rule forever in England, which is something that I had to consider when deciding which way to vote. Very interesting, I think, from the Icelandic point of view is that the Scottish government are explicitly using this argument about smallness. They're saying independence allows us to be small. We will not have the guilt of, you know, British imperialism and intervention in Iraq or all those nasty things. We will not really have to have a sufficient defence because everybody accepts that no small state can really defend itself, that it relies on international support. We will be honest brokers, we will be more convincing in working for peace and so on. And here we come to the point that there are different ways of being a small state, but what the Scots want to be is a Nordic-type small state. They're extremely clear about this. They have published a policy paper on Nordic and Baltic initiatives that they would like to follow. Specifically, they want to get nuclear weapons off their territory, that Scotland would not be a nuclear weapons state. They want to reach the maximum spending on overseas aid. They want to have a world initiative for climate, refugees, and you know all these typical kind of Nordic, what the literature calls norm entrepreneur roles. That is the role that Scotland would like for itself. So I think it's interesting when you talk about relations with Europe to say what Europe. Scotland is not in a hurry to belong to the Europe of Berlusconi or Orban or even of Hollande or Merkel. It's a very particular type of European role that it aspires to. Overall, I would say that Scotland's movement for independence is not part of new populism. I think that's easy to say because it's not new. It goes back so far in history. And I would dare to define it as a kind of mature nationalism. I think it's reflected in the fact that Scots know that they ran their own affairs as a kingdom for 1,000 years. And in that time, they also did all the bad things and made all the mistakes at a certain time that any nation can do. So they look at the world in a fairly calculating and practical way. And you'll find that in the documents of the Scottish independence campaign, a very great deal is said about foreign affairs, which is not actually something that you find in other nationalist or separatist movements, except for sort of negative things. We don't like the abroad, we don't like foreigners. But what the Scottish government has said is that first Scotland has to stay in NATO, although this is against the pacifist preferences of most of their own voters, but we have to stay in NATO just simply for protection, so that we can then be a small state and exploit our advantages, including being involved in the new Arctic, for instance. They think that the stability of NATO's role is something that they have to accept and pay a price for. As we've heard, they want to be in the EU. That means that, 50% of their sovereignty as an independent Scotland would go back to the EU. So, okay, we are getting something in return for that sacrifice. They also accept, and this is maybe the most telling point, that they would be very dependent on the rest of the UK, which is what our UK stands for. They want to keep the Queen, they want to keep the pound. And interestingly, when the London government said, oh, if you keep the pound, you realise that we will have to have a single monetary policy to sustain the value of the pound, and that will have to be set in London, the Scottish government said, well, sure, I mean, that will give us a bit of protection and stability in the early days. Maybe in 5-10 years we can see if we can join the euro, but we want to be run from London. And the only answer of the London government was, well, we don't want to give you the pound. And many people on the pro-union side will at this point in the argument say, well, what's the point of being independent if you're going to give up so much freedom to the US through NATO membership, to the EU and the European Commission? When you accept that some of your decisions will be taken in London, what's the point? And I think it reflects a fundamental misunderstanding on the part of English people, or indeed other Scottish people, to ask that. Because the point is simply, I think, to make one's own choices, and to make those choices in a way that reflects values and aspects of identity felt to be Scottish. What's perhaps unusual in the Scottish case is that they would be the first to admit that a large part of those values and a large part of those elements of identity are shared with others in Britain, in Europe, and perhaps even more widely. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Alison. Now we have time for 1 or 2 questions.
Thank you very much. My name is Baldur Simonasson. Practical and calculating as the Scots are, it may be possible that some of them will be voting yes out of spite. Out of spite for London, for the Tories, the banks, the European Union Common Fisheries Policy, and even unfortunate remarks recently made by someone on the no side, like Lord Robertson, former Secretary General of NATO, who seemed to prophesy the end of Western civilization if Scotland became independent. Do you think that some people will be motivated thus?
I absolutely agree with you, and it would be interesting if we had time to talk about the debate itself, because there is no doubt, and I say it with apologies to the British Embassy, but the central UK government has not handled this well. They have said a number of things that are plainly not true, or at least not provable, and they have taken a threatening, unpleasant line. They have said some things that seem to me personally morally unacceptable. For instance, that an independent Scotland would dishonour the people who died for Britain in the last 2 wars. I mean, I don't see how you can say that. By the way, forgetting all the Scots who died in the 1,000 years when they were independent in order to keep their independence. So yes, I think there will be some people who will vote out of spite and out of an emotional reaction. I think it will be a fairly small number. I would doubt if it was enough to swing it to a yes vote overall. It's interesting, though, that they can do that because they feel relatively safe. You know, they know that if the worst happened, so to speak, and independence did go through, Scotland would still remain a rich place and an honoured nation and that kind of thing.
So we heard about emotional nationalism, but this is more of a cerebral nationalism. Reason speaks.
Well, it is sort of reason and a rejection of unreason. I mean, you do hear them in response to some of the things coming from London saying, how stupid do they think we are? You know, so it is an attempt to assert a kind of higher logic, I think.
We have a question at the back for you.
I would like you, Alison, to evaluate a little bit the different campaigns. On the one hand, what seems to me to be a cohesive, coordinated and very well-run campaign by the yes vote with a talismanic person like Alexander, and on the other side a person who's not very popular in Iceland, at least, Dali.
Yes.
And it seems to me that the no side lacks focus. They don't exactly know what are the best arguments, while Salmond and the Scottish National Party know exactly where they're going.
Again, I can only say yes, and you are, of course, a very well qualified observer of these kinds of processes. In the first place, Alex Salmond and his team have been consistent. They've been cerebral in that they've thought through their tactics very carefully, and you can see them saying different things to different audiences. Hear how pro-NATO they are when they go to Washington, for instance, and how pro-EU they are in Brussels. But at the same time, Salmond is a charismatic person, and he comes over as generous. And it's very easy for him to play the small state card. Say, look how nice we are. We only want to work with you, London, and you're slapping us in the face. He is a genius at playing this. He has behind him a very efficient set of officials in Edinburgh. I have consulted with them on factual aspects, and I know that they have taken enormous care with their research, including on research in the Nordic model. And many of the best academic commentators are on their side, although interestingly there are some very good Scottish media commentators pleading for continued union. The problem on the other side is that there are three parties, Labour, Conservative and Lib Dems, who all hate each other to a certain extent and would naturally use different arguments towards Scotland, particularly since the left versus right issue is so much a part of the referendum campaign. They have tended to leave it in the hands of older politicians who maybe have not really thought through the new circumstances. And David Cameron himself has kept a very low profile and has so far refused to debate face-to-face with Alex Salmond. I still think that they will win, but I think that they will win in spite of the campaign rather than because of it.
Thank you, Alison. We're at the end of our program and the end of our time, indeed. I'll remind all of you there's a following symposium in the series next Monday on human rights in the EU. But before we leave, I suggest we thank and applaud our three distinguished speakers again, who have left us with a lot to talk about and a lot to discuss. Thank you.